Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is learning and how uncomfortable it can be to be learning something new and unfamiliar, and particularly as adults, how disorienting it can be to be exploring something new and unfamiliar. So it should be a fun conversation. Good morning, Roslyn. Welcome to you and everybody else who's joining us. So we're starting off the week talking about learning. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome. So we're talking about learning, and this comes about, maybe it's partly learning, partly understanding. This comes about because I've been engaged with a thought school through this wonderful thought leader named Carol Sanford. And periodically we have these weekend gatherings where we on Zoom engage in certain exercises, awareness exercises, and deeper process for recognizing how we think, and also introducing new modes of thought. So many of the people that are in this group have been there for years, and I'm a newbie. And so I'm experiencing feeling quite confronted by my attempts to understand what the culture is, what the rules are, what the language is, because while they may use familiar English words, they use them in different ways. And so it's quite disorienting. My experience is being quite disoriented and sometimes frustrated and curious, and also trying to assess, or discern what the structure is, what the meanings are. It's been a really interesting experience to watch myself in the context of this new territory. So it has made me, or I have chosen actually, to be looking at what is learning and what's learning like for me. And for 18 years, I had an Adobe software training center, and I taught adult learners. And adult learners are tough because as adults, we're not used to the awkwardness of learning something new, the stumbling, the tripping, the scraping one's knee, and the stumbling our way to mastery, right? Or to understanding, comprehension, whatever. And so it's been really interesting to me to be looking at how do I learn. And I think it's an interesting thing for all of us to look at, like, what is learning? How do we learn the definition of a word, for instance? Because, and this also goes to AI, and how is AI learning, right? So I've been thinking about this because I have been dabbling with AI, and in thinking about how does it learn, what I came to, at least so far, is that it's given tons of examples of context for different words or phrases. In the case of AI, way more than we're given as children learning language, right? But we're given context, we're given associations where this matches that, and we keep testing it against our experience to see if that correlation holds up. And that's how we generate an understanding, is by, at least this is my theory at the moment, is that we make a correlation and we test it and we test it, and in different contexts, we're exposed to it in different situations and circumstances, and through those exposures and synthesizing that information, we generate a more holistic, perhaps, idea of the meaning of something, of a word or a phrase, for example. And also how to behave, where we test behaviors in the same way, and sometimes there are consequences that we don't like, so we readjust, we recalibrate, and learn new behaviors to maneuver in different circumstances. So it's interesting to see this process of testing and retesting and recalibrating to come to some kind of sense of familiarity or comfort within a context. So I wonder if you've ever had the experience where you use a word and somebody says, "What does that word mean?" And you try to define it and realize that you don't necessarily have the words to define it, or you don't actually know the specific definition, but you have a sense of the word. And so in those cases, I often find myself saying, "Oh, you know what, let's just look it up." And it turns out that my sense of that word most often is correct, even though I couldn't necessarily define it in a clear way. And so when we think about language, we think about culture, we think about different behaviors, the things that are assumptions can act as limiters rather than as a vehicle for expansion sometimes, where we have these ideas that dictate the way that we hear things or see things or experience things, because that is a context that's pre-existing, that has been pre-created. And to be able to experience beyond the constraints, I'm going to say, of that context can be really challenging. The context can act as a delimiter, as a constraint. Other times, too, the context can act as a stepping stone to understanding, to expansiveness, too. If I understand this, then I can understand that, or it offers me an entree into this other realm that might expand that understanding. So I invite you to check out, to see if you can see how you learn, and be alert to that process. And when is it, once we've learned something, I think it takes awareness to not become automatic with it, to not assume it to our detriment, or to the degree that it limits our experience. I remember years ago, I read the book, The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. And he was talking about psychedelic experience and how, rather than the mind being something that allows us to grasp all of reality, instead it's a funnel, a delimiter, a sorter that limits our experience so that we can function better. Good morning, April. Wow, it's been a long time. How wonderful to have you joining us this morning. So we're talking about learning, and how once we've learned something, it allows us to dispense with a lot of other options. So, for instance, we learn how to do something, then we can do that thing over and over and over. And we tend to then oftentimes lapse into being very automatic in our behaviors, right? Once we learn how to do something, we can go on autopilot and just do that thing and check out in many cases. And so as folks who are on a journey of awakening and self-exploration and transformation, we want to allow ourselves to be present in our lives. And that means not going on automatic. So there's this dance. Well, as I'm speaking this, I'm getting that there's this razor's edge or tightrope to walk between knowing and some degree of mastery and not knowing or being present. And how do we create the balance of knowing and not knowing? So for instance, making a bed, we learn how to make a bed, and we have our routine for making that bed, and that routine works, it's efficient, it's effective. And then how do we then not become automated in our making of the bed? what we get to do is cultivate presence in the process of that routine, perhaps. So it's a fine line. It's a fine line to bring ourselves present to the routines of our lives. The saying that comes to mind right now is, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. What's different is not the action, the outward action, but what's different is the quality of presence. That we may make a bed automatically, or we may make a bed with presence. And the quality of the experience is night and day, while the routine itself may be the same. So when we learn things, we learn behaviors, right? We learn beliefs, in fact. And oftentimes these beliefs and behaviors are invisible to us because we've just become so automatic about them. And the question is, how do we bring our presence, or in this school of thought, our will, our ability to choose, which comes from, in my interpretation, a space of presence, how do we bring that to the mix? So Rosalind says, I went through a series of courses in non-duality. I'm loving that thought, Rosalind. Wow. It helped my spirituality. However, the last course shattered my view as it was presented, that it was just a model. I love that. I love that. And I love the phrase, just a model, because really, really, how else do we interact with the world other than through models? It's just a construct. And I suspect that there may be a reality with a capital R. I'm not absolutely convinced that that's the case, but if there is, I don't think it's something that we particularly get access to. So Rosalind says, now life since then has been awkward, finding a new footing, and it's brought new openings, as you do here. Thank you, Rosalind. I appreciate that acknowledgement. Thank you. Yeah, so what happens is, when our paradigm gets disrupted, I love that you use the imagery of finding footing, because it is awkward. It's like, whoa, what do I stand on now? What's the foundation? Where's the solid ground to walk on? And when we're learning, we're trying to construct that solid ground, I think. We're trying to put together some kind of construct that allows us to not have to think about where we're putting each footfall. So much of our lives is about dispensing with having to relearn ways to navigate. We become habituated to certain ways of navigating. So fortunately, we don't need to learn how to walk again every day. It was really, this was also really interesting, that one of the people in one of the conversations was asserting that if you don't use it, you lose it, about learning. And my response was, well, when you learn how to ride a bicycle, you can still ride a bicycle. And they said, well, that wasn't in fact the case for them. They used to ride a bicycle, and then they started riding again, and they had to relearn. And they said they experienced fear that they had to overcome certain fear. I think that there's a distinction between the fear of doing something and the doing of something. The mechanics of riding the bicycle, they didn't challenge having to relearn that and having to relearn how to find that center of balance. They didn't challenge that. They said that they had a fear around it. And so maybe what they needed to relearn was being fearless, perhaps, when it came to riding a bicycle. That reminds me of another experience. I went whitewater rafting with a bunch of people from work at one point years ago. It was part of a team building experience. And we went through these rapids. It was called Pinball. And we dumped the raft, and several of us were floating down the river through these rapids. One person got a concussion, and what I remember was going past all these people and almost just continuing down the river, like beyond them, somebody threw a rope and I was able to catch the rope. And I don't know how that happened, but the experience was tremendously traumatizing for me, where my experience was that I almost drowned. And we had to get back on the raft to continue down to the end of the river. You couldn't get off the river at that point. And so all the people that hadn't ended up going through the rapids with no raft were very jovial and playful and having a great time. Meantime, for me, it was terrifying. I felt terrified because I knew that it could be deadly. Like, I learned that this could be a deadly experience. And so I had just experienced this trauma, and everybody else was just like being happy-go-lucky and not really paying attention. Whereas due to this circumstance, my attention was laser focused on being careful, being aware. So my awareness of the danger was so deeply heightened. So I was more present to the river and the movement and the sensations of that experience than the other people were, in that they were able to enjoy it, whereas I was in a self-preservation mode. It was a wild experience. And so I had a very radical learning that they did not have. And that was of the seriousness or the potential danger. And for me, it wasn't potential anymore. And because they didn't have that experience, they didn't even have any cognizance of it. You know, the fact that somebody had turned the raft over, it was no big deal, because they hadn't experienced it. They hadn't experienced that they might just be floating down the river all by themselves and having to go through these rapids and boulders and navigating all the dangers of the roiling water. So it was a very, very interesting experience to be in a space of that dramatic a contrast of context that changed in a heartbeat. You know, up until that moment, it was very light and playful for me. And then afterwards, it was not. And I can't say I've been whitewater rafting since, actually. That was many years ago. And it's not something that holds a lot of intrigue for me at this point, I can say. So learning, we can have pretty profound one-time learning experiences where our whole foundation is changed. Like you said, Rosalind, that having this course in non-duality, you had a new orientation that at the end of it was shattered in that you said, okay, well, this is theoretical, this is a model. If we can allow ourselves to recognize that that's pretty much our entire experience, is that we have a model, and we test it against reality or experience to validate it, to vet it, whatever. And then something can happen that completely derails it. And then what? We question everything. We question ourselves, we question our circumstances. And then we look to reconstruct some kind of scaffolding, some kind of structure within which we can live, some kind of constraints or context, so that we can make sense, because human beings are meaning-making machines. That's what we do. We make things meaningful, and we assign meaning, and we interpret meaning, and that's kind of what gives us guidance to allow us the courage to put one foot in front of the other. We have to allow ourselves to believe it's safe to do that. You know, that we can put one foot in front of the other and not step off the edge of the cliff, or not step through the floor, for instance. We make these assumptions, and it's through the assumptions that we give ourselves the context that allows us to do and conceive and assume more. It's pretty interesting, this learning thing, learned behaviors. You know, we might learn the best way to get from here to there, or the most efficient way. And then there's a detour, and it's like, oh my gosh, now what? You know, we get to recalibrate. And there's some merit to allowing ourselves to recalibrate with some regularity. Rosalind says, I questioned just everything, and maybe that was part of the process, but it was to a degree that it was debilitating. Thankfully, I'm no longer experiencing that. I've experienced that myself, Rosalind. There were times in my life where I recognized that words don't communicate, and we each have our own worlds. And there was a point where I just couldn't even talk, because I knew that the words that I said weren't words that you would necessarily understand. And so it's interesting going into this scenario that I was telling you about, this community where there are rules, there are ways they use language. They don't necessarily believe that there are rules, but there are. And so that's where what I was wrestling with. It was fascinating. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you, thank you, thank you for engaging in these challenging, hopefully insight-producing conversations. And I'm Mira Rubin. This is The Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living. So until next time, so much love to you.